topics under 2.1 in 6th grade, and then under the Study Island lesson, fractions, decimals, and percents. So you're going to want to take good notes today because we're going to have to remember how to convert between those three types of numbers. And the first couple of times to do it, you're going to need those notes to refer to. And so if I'm ever going too fast, you can just pause and rewind so you can get caught back up. And you can even pause at the beginning of the question, work the problem out, and watch the video to see where you got things right and where you got things wrong, because you're going to remember your mistakes better that way, and you'll be more likely to do it right the next time. So don't be afraid to try these problems out, and I'm looking forward to today's lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at all the different ways to go between a fraction, a decimal, and a percentage. So if you want to convert from a fraction to a decimal, you're going to have to divide the numerator by the denominator. So that means the numerator goes underneath the division symbol and the denominator goes outside. And you're probably going to have to add a decimal and some zeros underneath the division sign in order to carry that problem out. A percentage, you are going to start with dividing the numerator to denominator to get it to a decimal. And then once it's a decimal, you can either multiply by 100 or move the decimal 2 places to the right. And then you add the percent symbol. When you multiply it by 100, the pattern occurs that it moves it 2 places to the right, so that's why you can take that shortcut. If you start with a decimal and you want to go to a percentage, you're going to go ahead and it's going to be the same as up here, only you get to skip that first part. So you can either multiply by 100 or move the decimal 2 places to the right and add your percent symbol. If you want to convert your decimal to 100 or to a fraction, you're going to have to look at what place value that last decimal is in. So in this example, it's in the hundredths place, so I'm going to put it over 100. So I put 75 over 100, and then I just have to reduce that fraction to get my final answer. And then lastly, if you're starting with a percent, to convert that to a fraction, a percent is always out of 100. If you get 100% on a quiz, you get them all right. So you're going to put that percent over 100 and then reduce the fraction. And then to convert it to a decimal, you are going to either divide by 100, or anytime you divide by 100, the pattern occurs that you move the decimal places 2 places to the left. And so you can also just follow that pattern. Then here are just some common decimals and percentages and fractions that you might use a lot. These would be worth memorizing typically. And so you can look at 1 over 1, that's 1, which is 100%. And that would be if you had everything. If you had 1/3, that would be 0.3 repeating, so 0.33333 forever. And that would be 33.3 repeating percent. If you had 1/4, that would be the same as 0.25, which would be 25%. And you can go ahead and pause and look at the rest of these that are the common ones. So once you have all of these notes taken, go ahead and unpause and we can go ahead and start some questions. So first here, I'm starting with a decimal and going to a percent. So when I go from a decimal to a percent, I can either multiply by 100, or I can just remember that a percent always looks bigger than the decimal does. So I have to move my decimal 2 places to the right to make it a bigger number. And so 0.36 is going to be 36%, which is letter D. Next, here's an example on how to move a fraction to a percent. Remember, a fraction bar means division. So that means I'm going to have to do division here. Remember that the numerator, the top, is what goes underneath. And then the 50, the denominator, is what's going to go out front. And so 50 doesn't divide into 23, so I'm going to have to add a decimal and a 0. And I'm going to go ahead and add the decimal up top. And then I can see how many times does 50 go into 230. It goes in 4 times. And then 50 times 4 is 200. And then I do that subtraction, and I'm left with 30. And so I still have a remainder, so I'm going to start writing another 0 and then bring that 0 down. And then I have how many times does 50 go into 300? It goes in 6 times. 6 times 50 is 300. And I subtract those numbers, and I'm left with 0, so I don't have any remainder left. So that means that 23 over 50 is the same as 0.46. And so, but that's a decimal, so to convert it to a percent, I'm going to have to take that 4.6 and move the decimal 2 places to the right to make the number bigger, and that's going to make 46%, which is going to be B, my final answer. This next question is how to convert a percent to a decimal. So the percent to a decimal, I can either divide that number by 100, or I can remember that decimals always appear smaller than the percents. So that means I'm going to have to move the decimal 2 places to make it smaller, which is to the left. And when I move that decimal 2 places to the left, it's going to be 0.41, which is choice A, my final answer. This is an example of how to convert a fraction to a decimal. So if I have this fraction, and I want to convert it to a decimal, that's when I'm going to remember that the fraction bar means division, and I'm going to have to divide these two numbers. So the denominator is going to be in the front of my division symbol, and the 2 is going to be underneath. 3 can't be divided into 2, so I'm going to have to add a decimal and a 0. And I'm going to put the decimal in the right above in the answer so I can keep track of that. 3 goes into 20 6 times. So I put the 6 above the 0 and the 20, the last digit. 6 times 3 is 18. And I subtract those numbers, and I'm left with 2. I still have a remainder, so I'm going to add another 0 and bring that down. And that gives me 20. 3 divided into 20 happens 6 times again. 6 times 3 is 18, and I subtract that, and I'm left with 2 again. And so I can see that there's a pattern occurring. So that probably means that I'm going to have 6s continuing on and on forever. And when I look at my answers, they only go out 2 decimal places, and so I have enough information to know that letter C, 0.66, is going to be my final answer. Here's an example of how to convert a percent to a fraction. So remember that 50% is going to be out of 100%. So that means I can put 50 over 100, and then I can just reduce that. So right away, I know that because they both end in 0, I can divide them both by 10 to reduce that. So 50 divided by 10 is 5. And 100 divided by 10 is 10. And so I can say, okay, I'm going to have to, 5 and 10, I can take a 5 out of both those numbers. So I'm not quite done reducing it. So I'm going to divide both of these numbers by 5. And 5 divided by 5 is 1. And 10 divided by 5 is 2. And that's going to leave me 1/2. I can't reduce that anymore. So that's going to be my final answer. So that makes sense. If you get 50% right on a quiz, you've gotten half the questions right. This last example is how to convert a decimal to a fraction. And so a decimal to a fraction, I look at what place value that last number is in. So this number here is in the tenths place value. So that means I'm going to put that number over 10. And so I'm going to have 8 over 10, and then I just have to reduce that. 8 over 10, they are both even numbers, so I'm going to divide both by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 4 over 5, I can't reduce that anymore, so that's going to be my final answer, C. So I've done an example of each type of problem you're going to see in this section. So if you come to one and you don't remember the steps, just go through the video and look at the headings at the top and look for the one where it tells you what kind of number you're starting with at the beginning. So I started with a decimal here, so decimal first. And then my answers were fractions. So the fraction was the second word. And look for that example and watch that part of the video again if you need to. And then you can use that as a guide to help you answer the questions you're trying on your own. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.